Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And welcome to Climate and Cuisine, a podcast of Climate Diet. My name is Jane DeMarinis, and I'm Executive Director of Climate Diet. And we are thrilled today to have as our guest Chloe Sorvino, the author of a groundbreaking book about the meat industry. And as you know, our name, certainly this topic is close to our heart. Her book is Raw Deal, and I'll just show you a copy. Um, Hidden Corruption, Corporate Greed, and the Fight for the Future of Meat. She is also the leading journalist at Forbes magazine in coverage of food, drink, and agriculture. So she obviously knows whereof she writes and speaks. Her work has been featured on NPR, the Financial Times, New York Magazine, and now at Climate Diet in today's podcast. So please join me in welcoming Chloe Sorvino. Welcome, Chloe.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to jump in.
So let's jump in with my first question. I guess it's hard for me to ignore this first question. Are you a vegan? And does it, if so, does that impact how you think about meat? Or really, I guess what I'm trying to get to, what inspired you to write this compelling book?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking that. I think that's a really great place to start. So, no, I'm not a vegan, but I try really hard to eat as many plant-based foods as possible. My typical week starts with me on a Monday making a pot of beans from working from home for lunch, and that pot of beans is pretty much eaten throughout the week for me and my husband. I'm a member of the Rancho Gordo Bean Club, which I'm quite obsessed with. And through my CSA, I get a mushroom share, I eat eggs, and I do eat some meat when I try not to eat meat when I'm out because it's really hard to know where meat comes from when you're at a restaurant or anywhere else. And when I'm at home and I'm sourcing meat, I take very serious and strict kind of precautions on how I'm sourcing that and where it's coming from. And I really make sure that I go the distance to know what those farms are like, how those workers are treated. And, from writing this book, I've spent a decade at Forbes in the business world investigating, billionaire power, what really makes this meat industry work, the profiteering involved, and all these other kind of crazy things. And through that, I have, learned that the devil's in the details and have really scaled back how I eat and thought really hard about it. And that's part of why I wanted to write this book. I think there's so much confusion out there and with labels and sourcing it and it's grass-fed, really grass-fed. What does pasture raised mean versus, free range? And, that's unfortunately by design. These corporations want us to be confused. And I've tried to make sure that I can share what I've learned. And when I think about sourcing meat, we can get into it a little bit more. But when I think about it, I am trying really hard to not only be focused on what the meat itself is like, but also the economic systems behind that and how that can be a force for change.
Well, let me jump in there, and that's such good information for our listeners and viewers. As a Forbes reporter covering food and agriculture prior to writing Raw Deal, were you already aware of the concentration and consolidation of the meat industry? And maybe adding on to that as a set follow-up, how has that affected the small farmers across the United States, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I started at Forbes more than a decade ago on a team that a lot of people start out on at Forbes, which is the wealth team. And that means I was doing the back end valuations for the billionaires you see on our kind of signature list, the World Billionaires list, the Forbes 400. And so I was fresh out of college and quickly got this kind of rude awakening of just how much concentration and particularly there is in the meat industry and how much wealth and power has been concentrated by only a small handful of billionaires and corporations. And that was really stark. And so that's how I came to this. I was putting out, articles, touring slaughterhouses, sharing new billionaires that are in beef and chicken and that kind of had been hiding in plain sight and how they came to control so much of the meat supply. And it's really staggering. In beef, the top four players have control of more than 80 to 85% of the entire industry. In pork, it's more than 70% for the top four players. And in chicken, when I wrote the book and when it came out in 2022, it was more than 50%. And there's been, since another merger, another consolidating, move. And now in chicken, the top four players control, more than 60%. And just to kind of put that into perspective, the Department of Justice, when they're looking at antitrust, they typically say if the top four firms in an industry control 20 to 25%, that is, a majorly consolidated industry. So that just goes to show just how much more and how the meat industry has been let, kind of get so much more concentrated. And really that concentration and consolidation has happened and been solidified only in the past, 10 to 15 years, 20 years. It started 40 to 50 years ago, but it's continued to get worse just in the past few years.
I love that part of your book, just showing how that happened over time and the buying up of the small farmer. And so maybe
Yeah,
that
yeah.
leads to when you have this kind of concentration. I was going to ask you during the Biden administration, they
Sure.
fined the four big meat producers for price fixing. And of course, that was during COVID when people were out of jobs, people were sick, and then these were the highest prices being charged ever. So I wonder, do you think there was any result even from these fines, which were in the millions of dollars? I think totally of those four, it was 484 million around there that was fined by Biden. But did you see anything? I'm sure you're aware of that. Did you see any
Oh yeah.
result?
So, I mean, I have a whole chapter in my book about the price fixing lawsuits. There's hundreds, about 100, if not more, of these lawsuits in beef, pork, and chicken. Some of them are consumer-led lawsuits. Some of them were, actually the government like looking into some of these things. And then most of them really were actually from customers of these meat packers, folks like McDonald's and Kroger, and
Mm.
distributors like Cisco who were mad that they were having to pay more. And I think it's important to talk about, it's not just that the prices were going up and that these firms had to pay more, and the customers end up having to pay more. It was also that, the land is getting destroyed. There's environmental destruction, there's water pollution, there's soil pollution, there's air pollution that's happening, while at the same time, workers are being forced to work on the line to get this meat out. And then in 2020, let's talk about that because that was all happening when then most of this meat was actually getting exported out of the country. And we have such, kind of hunger and accessibility issues in this country to begin with when it comes to getting access to healthy, sustainable protein. And yeah, most of it was getting exported to China and South America and Europe and around the world, which is is
So
is
our
is
climate, I
devastating when you
like
think about the environmental consequences.
yeah, I really loved that part of your book where you talked about the fact that we're actually wrecking our own part of the world to supply meat to other parts of the world. And there's no one challenging this cost to all of us. Um,
Yeah, there's a national security issue kind of inherent to that, right? And while I don't think, I think exports, obviously it'd be a hard thing to stop those completely. I do think, you think about that, you think about how much foreign corporations are buying up farmland in this country, and there will continue to be tensions that arise from that, especially as climate crisis gets worse.
well, talking again about the price of meat, I was surprised at how the dollar spent um, is divvied up essentially by the
Mhm.
different industries. Could you, for our viewers and listeners, just explain that? Because I was kind of floored by the big amount of money that was going to just one retailer.
Sure, absolutely. So, yeah, this is within the past decade, actually, it's even gotten worse. And so, when you think about like that $1 spent and how it's distributed and where it actually ends up, farmers are getting only like, a few cents. I believe it's right now currently 16 cents for every dollar, right? When they're obviously putting in the majority of the work and putting
Right.
their own families, their health on the line to make meat and to raise these animals. Meat packers have increased their share over the years and they're getting more than ever before. But really, the most fascinating thing to me, which you pointed out, is that, the retailers, they have been increasing their share the most. They've pretty much commandeered the vast majority of the dollar that is going towards, every purchase. And it brought up a very interesting tension for me, because, I came at this having done the valuations of the Tyson family and Joe Grendy's of Cook Foods and the Cargill family and all these major players in meat. And, their retort to, why do you have so much power in the meat industry is, well, you know what? We just have to dictate. We have to do the prices that Walmart says we have to. We have to take their price. And they do have some power to negotiate, obviously, but Walmart and the rise of that retailer and also Amazon, but Walmart's kind of it's not a monopoly, it's actually called a monopsony, which I get into in the book. But the fact that there is so much power there and they have the ability to dictate all, price and have, all these specifications, very, very, very kind of granular things about how meat must be delivered. And if that is wrong, that it creates huge backups in the system. And so the amount that Walmart has commandeered is a huge thing. And when we think about monopolies in the meat industry or, potentially breaking up, can the eggs be unscrambled? You can't really unscramble the eggs without also dealing with this other problem, which is that there's still, even if you broke up all the meat packers and distributed that in different ways, you'd still have to deal with the fact that Walmart is at the end of the day the top meat seller in the country, the biggest grocer. And if that is not broken up, you'll still have this uneven, situation where then it'll kind of continue to make the meat packers consolidate all over again. And so you have to deal with this monopsony issue, this massive amount of like power that these retailers like Walmart and Amazon have.
Well, getting back to what you explained in your book and how the dollar is broken up, if I'm remembering this correctly, Walmart, I think it was specifically mentioning Walmart is taking almost half, 48 cents out of that dollar, so 48% of the profit, and their part is would seem to be the easiest to just put it on the shelf or the cooler.
Right.
Where
Right.
here's the farmer getting what, 16%, and he's got to haul these, care for these animals, feed them, take them to the market too. The transportation costs, I would assume, are huge for getting 2-ton animals or whatever they weigh, 1 ton, 2-ton animals en masse and I think in your book they're going across several states. Most of the meat processing is done, I don't know, is it Kansas? Or anyway, that area.
Iowa, Nebraska, it depends on which type of meat, right? I mean, Nebraska is huge for beef. Chicken happens a lot in Alabama, Arkansas, Kansas area. I mean, there's a lot in Ohio and Illinois as well. Pork is a lot in North Carolina, for example. But really, this consolidation that's happened in the past 40 to 50 years, it was driven by corn and having to overfatten these livestock super quickly to make them grow as quick as possible so they could get to the slaughterhouse as quick as possible. And because of that, where these slaughterhouses were moved out of the cities, and moved closer to where the corn and the soy are grown. And so that, it made these like mega plants kind of start getting erected, in the grain belt in the heartland, of America.
So while we're on price, I know right now, not that I'm buying any of it, but the price of meat is at record levels. And I
Hmm.
wanted to ask you what you think is causing that. And are Europeans, uh, you know, are they paying the same prices? I would think not. I have a follow-up question on that, but I'll save it. But if you could just talk about the price
Sure.
right now and why we're at these record levels.
Sure. I mean, right now you have a lot of different factors leading to that, aside from this decade of kind of unprecedented profit making and price fixing that had been happening, especially in chicken, but across the meat industry. You also in beef have the smallest herd in years, and so that has created like supply and demand shifts where beef has now become really really high. In chicken, you have avian flu, which has been causing a lot of flocks to have to get completely depopulated or essentially like killed in their houses, and that has also obviously then brought down supply, brought up pricing. But it's also, a bit more than that because you know, these prices, these are commodities, sure, but there also are like long-term contracts, other ways that meat packers have been, working with fast food companies, distributors to kind of set prices long term. And these prices have gotten locked in. And it's interesting because, meat and food in general in this country, I should say, really, it's both too expensive and too cheap, right? Workers are not getting their fair share. The farmers are not getting their fair share, but at the same time, consumers are paying more than they ever have. And that's because, corporations have been taking share of profits and have been putting that onto the consumers and making them pay for these differences, which are still then almost always going to their bottom line, which is really kind of crazy. I mean, you see that in egg prices right now with avian flu as well. I mean, Cal-Maine's profits have soared incredibly so just in the past few years with avian flu. And so, you know, in Europe, meat packers like to talk about how in America, meat is really cheap and that's what makes everyone happy. And in Europe, if prices were like what they are in Europe, that the people would be rioting in the streets. And I think we're actually getting to a point where we're actually quite close to where Europe is. And I think especially as people are considering more just the true cost accounting and how meat packers are increasing their prices while still shunting so many costs down the line to taxpayers, from the environmental destruction to, the antibiotic resistance that's creating a public health crisis to just simply how workers have been manipulated and subjugated over time. They've had the power to continue to dictate that. And, you know, I, I think their talking point that meat is so expensive in Europe is really not holding true anymore. And especially as people are looking at more regional options, those regional prices, while they are quite high, they are what's on par with Europe, and people do pay that, and people in Europe eat less meat on their plate per day, and that's what we all need to be going towards. Factory farming really needs to end from a climate perspective, and we need to rethink how we are eating. I understand some people might want to still eat meat. It is a very bioavailable source of protein and other nutrients, but it needs to completely change. And I think if you have a modicum of access and ability to pay, it's on you as a meat eater, if you are a meat eater, to use that money to source meat that is not as harmful as it could be.
Well, I think that you're bringing up two additional topics that I wanted to ask your opinion on. Do you think the American consumer understands that protein is readily available from plants? I mean, as a vegan for 20, vegetarian or vegan for almost 24 years now, I understand it, but beans, lentils, legumes, broccoli even are high in protein.
Sure.
Nuts and other, there's
Rice.
many things you can eat to get protein. And there seems to be also an obsession with protein, I think, in this country. I mean,
Hmm.
people that work out or, and you should pay attention to it. But what is your opinion? Why is the American consumer so infatuated with meat when you get it from so many other places? You get the
It
protein
really
from.
is. Yeah, no, it really is this kind of quintessentially American culture and kind of phenomenon, right? In my book, I go into a little bit how in America, when meat prices are higher than they were before, they typically the congressional representatives, the president, they get voted out of office. It's like an interesting indicator of unrest in that way, or also of happiness, right? And there's been this overall trend, especially in America, of as you get more upwardly mobile, or if you have more wealth, or as you're getting more wealth, that people want to buy more meat, right? And so it's become kind of synonymous with wealth, right? Which is something very, enticing in a capitalistic society like America. And, aside from that, we have the culture of, the men out
Barbecue.
west ranching, barbecuing, this kind of quintessential American dream of ranching and making meat and eating your steak at night. And, that's all been
Yeah.
built on this kind of fraudulent idea. And while we
Yeah.
do need a lot of protein, these like carnivore diets, these like super high protein diets, while I understand there are some nutritional benefits, people are also like completely over consuming protein too. And kind of gotten into this like very uh, strange situation where there are folks that are like so into only eating meat, but then also there are so many other amazing plants, nutrients, abilities to eat food and transform what we eat in that way. And yeah, from rice, which is can even grow wild in this country, right? To tofus and tempehs and beans and tubers even. Um, those are the types of proteins and like production of food that we really need to be supporting and looking more to in years to come.
Our organization puts out plant-based recipes every Friday. So anyone
Cool.
listening that's not aware of those, just sign up for our newsletter and you'll get on the list for really good recipes. Some of them are my own and some are my daughter's, who's a kind of a vegan chef and a vegan spokesman in Tampa. But we don't test all the recipes, but others that I've tried are really delicious.
What's your
So
go-to?
we get a
What's your
bunch off
go-to
chat.
recipe? Yeah. Yeah.
We go to Chat GPT. And we add, you think maybe we're different, and our recipes show the greenhouse gas emissions that saved by eating
Interesting.
this particular recipe.
Cool.
So I really like that aspect of it. But it's a convenience, I think, for people to just have a source, and every week is a new one.
Sure.
Um, so I wanted to touch on something you brought up slightly, but in more detail, how workers are treated in the meatpacking industry. I did a little bit of research on this and wrote an op-ed, an opinion piece on this about a year ago, tied to Labor Day. And I was appalled at the injuries. It's in terms of injuries in the United States, I believe it's the highest industry
One of
for
yeah.
um, and the kind of injuries that people are getting. I mean, they're losing an arm, they're losing a leg. It's a dangerous business where, the arms with slabs of meat are coming at so fast that people can't handle them. Um, one woman was nearly crushed by some side of beef that fell on her, I read in an incident. But so those injuries are real. Typically, no one
Mhm.
complains because they're hiring often undocumented immigrants, or even immigrants
Mhm.
with green cards don't want to report them. They need the job. Um, and even before you get to the meat processing, farming has huge injuries. I went to Penn State, and Penn State did some research on this. And instead of relying on government data to show injuries in farming, they went to hospital emergency rooms, and the numbers were like quintupled or even 10 times what
Yeah.
was expected from farming injuries. So all of that is really dangerous. So the people are
Mhm.
clearly not compensated and often are just not reporting it because, again, many are, well, in farming, as you know, seasonal workers coming here from Mexico or other countries. Anyway, I do you have any comment about that, since
Absolutely.
it's uh it's just a dangerous business to be, their part of it is truly dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it is both one of the most dangerous workplaces in America, and also one of the most has the most vulnerable workers, some of the most vulnerable workers, most marginalized workers in America. And it's also one of the most, not only dangerous from a physical bodily harm standpoint, but it's also one of the most, violent kinds of workplaces too. My book details a lot of cases of harassment, um, racial discrimination, really serious, horrible types of cultures that, permeate in, the corners of these meatpacking facilities. It's not just amputations. It's not just, there's so many also just, kind of toxic chemicals, right, that can cause burns and different issues really so quickly. But yeah, it just goes even so much farther beyond that. And again, these workers, some of the most vulnerable, marginalized workers, most of them, from yeah, dozens of different countries around the world, many of them undocumented or, concerned about reporting different issues. And, it's really serious. One of the reasons I really wanted to write this book was because, in 2020, I was having conversations with these billionaires who were telling me things like, when it's raining gold outside, we're walking around with buckets. But then at the same time, I was also doing, interviews, like one with a worker, Michael Foster in Alabama at a chicken plant, who was telling me that, they were working, they were being first to work on the line. They had saran wrap dividers between them, no PPE, no masks, no nothing. The line speeds were being
COVID.
increased. They were pushing to have them get doubled, really even faster than ever before, at a time
You're
when,
talking about during
these are all going
during
so
COVID.
fast. Um,
During during COVID
COVID,
with the
yeah. And, the quote I included from him in my book was, at the same time as that, he didn't have chicken in his freezer. And that kind of just shows how vulnerable and how mistreated these workers really are. And, I'm proud to say that my Forbes story came out about the lack of PPE at these plants. And, the next day they were handing out masks and doing temperature checks, luckily, at this plant. But, it shouldn't have to be forced like that. And my book also goes into not just these kind of violent and cases of harassment, but also how these workers have been subjugated and how they're, especially in the chicken industry. I go into, a big lawsuit that, showed how workers had been financially manipulated and subjugated, with collusion happening allegedly to, control rates of hourly work, benefits, all of those sorts of, key worker rights.
I also in your book, which is phenomenal. You mentioned, and I had not heard about this before, but sexual abuse and sexual
Mhm.
aggression, making it so difficult for. I think you talk about one woman over and over again, and having to deal with this. I don't know if you want to add any more detail about that, and also being forced to just stay in the same place. I think she got transferred and the same thing happened in another line she was on.
Yeah, these workplaces, unfortunately, I've seen, so many of these lawsuits. I've read dozens and dozens of them across plants around the country, and I highlighted a few in my book to kind of be examples. But unfortunately, these are environments, these are workplaces that have predators lurking, and there are, serious cases of sexual discrimination, harassment, rape. I mean, the most violent of crimes that you can imagine. And often these workplaces are then blaming the woman or the survivor. And also, having a case of, often retaliation. And then, if they do come forward, then there become issues of firing or getting pushed into different parts of the plan or getting kind of pushed out. it's really so serious and devastating. And again, it's because these workers are some of the most vulnerable and they're doing dangerous jobs, but the industry keeps them hidden, and that's by design.
Yeah, again, I was really pleased to see you bring up the dangerous aspect of these plants, and I expect that a lot of them are more rural areas where people have a hard time finding other employment. I know you
Yes.
in your book you detail a story of a woman who was sick, and I think they called her and said, "You have to come back to work," and she was repeatedly sick. And I think ultimately they put her, she kept asking to be put in jobs where, because she wasn't healthy, that were a little bit easier. And I don't know if she fell into a vat, but it was so disturbing to read that story. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that was a really disturbing one for me. I think you're thinking of I think it was a case of a Native American woman who was then ended up getting forced to work in the gut bin. Maybe that was the one you were talking about, and she ended up having like a psychological breakdown because the horrors of kind of what she was seeing, the kind of the guts and blood and everything in this room that they had forced her to put her in after, retaliation for a really long time. Um, it was just too much. But there is also the case, one of the other cases that really sticks with me, UTIs are really common among workers in meatpacking plants. Workers often wear diapers because they aren't allowed enough bathroom breaks, which is
uh,
just like a horrible human rights violation, like a total ethical, very disturbing. And there was one case I wrote about a class action of several Black workers at one plant that Pilgrim's Pride and JBS own, and there was a one case that really just stuck with me, like of a pregnant woman who was not able to go to the bathroom and was still forced to work on the line. I mean, that's how serious, and that's like the level of disrespect and violence that are happening in these plants.
I wonder why OSHA hasn't,
I mean, they
you
have a
know,
little bit,
they
but it's
have.
like it's often like a slap on the wrist, you know? It's like these profits are
Yeah.
insane and the slap on the wrist can be, a few $1,000s, maybe 10,000, 15, 20. It's really not a lot. And that's even for like, an amputation or a death. There's been a lot of deaths recently of workers, and that really makes OSHA has to investigate all of that, right? Every time. But the, the fines that they get given are nothing comparatively.
Well, so I would like, as we move toward the end of this interview, which has just been so compelling, and thank you for writing this book for our country. I
I
hope
appreciate that. Thank
gets
you.
all the attention that it deserves. But maybe if we could, this is a little bit of a happy way
Sure,
to
please.
go. Recently, Rutgers did a survey, Rutgers University did a survey of 1,200 people, and it showed that nearly 70% of people that were surveyed were planning to cut back on eating meat. But the sad part of it was when they asked why they were doing it, it all had to do with price. So none of
Mm,
it related to their own health, because red meat has certainly been shown to contribute, the fat in saturated fat in red meat contribute to heart problems.
hmm
And in fact, that's why we became vegan. Someone in my
hmm
family that was
hmm
a direct result of that needing very big surgery. Um, but so not health, but also not climate. And
mm.
I think people are starting to get the message more, but according to the survey, maybe not really. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I tried to strike a tone in this book of being realistic, but also, having points and kind of a thread of some optimism and where I could see change working, just based on like my decade of speaking with, hundreds of founders, owners, investors, scientists, folks who are in this, farmers every day, workers, all of them. And unfortunately, I think what I've learned is that, even realism can be scary. And I don't think you can lead with fear. I don't think you can lead with that when trying to create change with diet like this. Unfortunately, people are strapped in all of these different ways. And, I'm here for change. If they're changing because of price, that's fine. But of course, prices could get changed back. And I think that's where you get some of these issues, right? Um, I think so. I think we can't lead with fear. And I think when you think about the climate implications, it becomes very scary very quickly. Also, when you think about the health implications, it can become scary very quickly. But at the same time, I do think there is a place for informing and providing people with the knowledge that can bring them power. And, I am hopeful. I do think we're in this kind of crazy time, especially just since the pandemic, with people thinking about where their food comes from for the first time, I think in a really kind of more eyes wide open sort of way. And with that, there has been momentum, and I've been hopeful that people are looking beyond just price when it comes to changing diet. Um, and I think I've been covering this avian flu outbreak, for example, for about 3 years now, and I haven't heard more people talking about it than I have in the past 2 months, right? So I think there are some of these kind of massive stories that are coming out that are making people think twice. And that's exciting.
Well, it has been my pleasure to have you, and for our listeners and viewers, their pleasure and edification to know about this book and hear you talk about it, because it is certainly a massive piece of research built
Thank
on
you.
your already extensive knowledge from your work at Forbes. So
Thank you
thank you
so much.
again. Our guest today is Chloe Sorvino, author of The Raw Deal: Hidden Corruption, Corporate Greed, and the Fight for Future of Meat. Get it on Amazon or many, many places. But Chloe,
Yeah,
thank you
anywhere
so
else.
much for being here, and congratulations on this wonderful book you've published.
Thank you so much, Jane. It was such a great time to speak with you, and I'm excited to connect with your audience and hopefully inspire more change. Thanks again.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us
Thank you,
today.
Jane. Thank you, Mac.
Signing off.
Appreciate it. Okay, thank you. Bye.